Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I was ready. We're going to do justice all day today and in the future, not just today. I'm going to talk with you. But first of all, Martha asked me to give the keynote. And as I was preparing what I wanted to say, I realized I didn't feel so keynote-ish. But more that I wanted to talk about a subject that's very dear to my heart and that is the main campaign issue that Alliance of Families for Justice is working on, and which we have reached out to our partners in the Justice Collective to join us in, and that's the subject of felony disenfranchisement. And that's why all of you have one of these on your seat or in your hands, and at some point I'll reference it, and if I don't, remind me that I'm supposed to before we end. But it seemed appropriate, particularly because during the very moving conversation last night, in the Q&A section, Jane raised the issue about power. And I said we would get to it today, and I think that it's almost taken for granted in the United States that there is some connection between power and voting. Now, some of us might be concerned that under the last presidential election, that theory is called into question, but then there's others who are gearing up ferociously for the next presidential election so they can really put that theory into practice and see how much people power can be brought to bear on the results. So what does it mean to vote? Is it safe to say that everybody, I don't know, maybe, has everybody in this room had the opportunity to vote at least once? Can you reflect back on what it felt like that first time that you voted? I'm not asking you to say how old you were at the time, but think about what it felt like. Was there some sense of, I'm an adult now, or I have the opportunity to have some influence on the result, or that your vote mattered, or maybe you were voting because you wanted to also model that for a younger person, that they should also take it seriously, or maybe some adult in your life played a role in encouraging you to go exercise your right to vote. And for some of you, you might have said, well, this is another manifestation of my rights as a citizen. I would imagine all those statements resonated in some way with everybody in this circle. And for many of you, it probably never occurred to you that your right to vote could be taken away. And that the right to vote is routinely taken away from millions, not thousands, millions of people in this country routinely, and we just assume that that's okay. We just assume that that's okay. And when you exercised your right to vote, you knew that you could vote for elected officials. You also could vote on laws, whether or not a particular resolution should be adopted, right? Or a policy, or maybe some impact on the school district where you live, or how tax dollars should be allocated. Zoning ordinances. Who was going, did I ring a bell?
Well, not where I live, but where I grew up. Yeah.
Okay. Or governance rules. Who was going to be the local sheriff? Who was going to be the district attorney? Who were going to be the judges who would decide cases that were brought in courts of law? And so you had a sense of belonging, being a part of, and having a voice. But there are many communities where everything I just described is exactly the opposite. People don't feel that they belong. They don't think that their voice matters, that they have a say-so in the laws that are passed, the allocation of funds, who are the elected officials, what the zoning ordinances may be, how resources are going to be dispersed to address the pressing needs in their community. For sure, they're not thinking that their voice has any impact on who the district attorney is going to be or who the judge is going to be. And all those feelings create disengagement. Disengagement from the civic process. Now, felony disenfranchisement, which is what I want to focus on. God bless you.
Thank you.
Felony disenfranchisement talks about, or is the manifestation of losing the right to vote because you've been convicted of a felony. Whether you've been incarcerated or not, you have a felony conviction, your right to vote can be taken away depending upon where you live in this country. I'm just talking about the United States. And it varies from state to state. I'll first talk about Maine and Vermont, which are the leading states with respect to this issue, because in Maine and Vermont, your right to vote is not taken away because you're convicted of a felony or because you're incarcerated. So people who are incarcerated in Maine and Vermont can vote. They can register to vote, and they vote just like any other citizen sitting around in this room, okay? Without any question about their right to vote. Now, I don't think I have to remind everyone that there's 50 states in this country, so Maine and Vermont are in the frightening minority. Our campaign is geared towards trying to make what happens in Maine and Vermont the norm, and that it would be an aberration for someone's right to vote to be taken away merely because they were convicted of a felony. In New York State, you cannot vote if you're convicted of a felony and you're incarcerated. And in this state, there's 46,000 people, approximately, who are incarcerated. So those 46,000 people who are incarcerated cannot vote. And just while we're talking numbers, I'll throw in some geography. Approximately 3/4 or so of those 46,000 people come from New York City. In fact, from 7 key communities in New York City. So if you think about the disproportionate impact of felony disenfranchisement on 7 key communities in New York City, all of those communities are populated primarily by people who look like myself. So you have severe felony disenfranchisement disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities in 7 key areas in New York City. There are another 38,000 people approximately in New York State who are on parole. The law on the books in New York State says that people on parole also cannot vote. That's the statute on the books. Last April, Governor Cuomo used his executive power to conditionally pardon parolees for the limited purpose of allowing them to register to vote. If he had not done that, a parolee who registered to vote was guilty of a felony. So yet another felony. Okay. So only because of the executive order could a parolee in New York State register to vote. So for the first time in New York State, parolees were registering to vote and voting. Okay. So think about the numbers. I said 46,000 people who are behind bars in this state can't vote. and another 38,000 can only vote because of this conditional part. So a major piece of legislative work that happened during this past legislative session in Albany was an effort to take Governor Cuomo's executive order and make it the statutory law. And I imagine most of you know, if not everyone, that there was a radical change in the majority of the state Senate this past year, such that the Senate majority became Democrat. And the state assembly majority was already Democrat. So on both sides of the aisle, there was a lot of fervor around making this executive order a law, statutory law. That effort failed. I'm going to come back to that, but that effort failed. So now I've given you the landscape in New York. I want to talk about what's happening in some other states. Many of you remember that in the past election in Florida, that something major happened. And that major thing was that the people, the 1.4 million people in Florida who had a felony conviction at some point in their lives, who had been permanently banned from ever voting, now that ban was eliminated. So you no longer in Florida had permanent banning from being able to vote because you had a felony conviction. Now, our not so progressive Floridians immediately got busy trying to institute new obstacles to voting for these 1.4 million people who were now newly able to vote. And there are several other states where there's permanent bans to voting. And then there are other states that the spectrum is pretty broad as far as what other states do. Some places say, once you're out of prison, you can vote. Some say, once you have completed your entire time on parole, you can vote. So if you are convicted of a crime for which your sentence was something, so many years to life, you are actually legally on parole for the rest of your life. So unless you are released from parole supervision early, you actually will never be allowed to vote in that state. So you see the spectrum is wide. But for our purposes here in the Adirondacks and in Heaven Hills, we're going to talk about New York. Now, other things did happen in the state legislature with respect to voting that helped to move the needle. Some of those things included allowing same-day registration. Also allowed absentee voting with no excuse for why you would be absent to vote in person. They also said, I think we removed the idea that if you didn't vote first in a certain number of elections, then you would drop the registration rolls. So once you register, you're registered for good. So those things help to move the needle forward. And so our campaign is geared toward building off of those victories during this past legislative session, so that next year we plan to move full steam ahead to, one, have the executive order codified so that parolees can vote, and that people who are incarcerated will be able to vote. So that we'll join the folks in Maine and Vermont and become leaders as opposed to followers. You know, New Yorkers get very arrogant about how progressive they are, and then they just hang their heads when a laundry list of things that we do backwards comes up. And then once the list is finished, then we put our heads back up and pretend to be progressive. So next year we want to try to turn some of that around. So what have we been doing to get ready? Because you know, we don't just wake up one morning and say, okay, we're up and at 'em and it's going to be all different next year. We've been kind of tilling the soil. I can say that even though I live in New York City. So what we've been doing to till the soil includes the following. We have been going and meeting with each member of the state assembly and each member of the Senate in their district offices Don't get worried, we're not finished by a long shot. We've been focusing primarily on those representatives who are in New York City, because that's where we live. And trust me, when I get to what you can do, we're gonna come back to that. So we've been meeting with them, whether we think they're gonna be in favor or not. Okay? And part of the reason, we have several reasons why we go to meet with them. One, it's always impactful when elected officials have constituents come to their office, because they figure if you took the time to come and talk to them, this is an issue that must matter. We also try to make sure that our team that's going to meet with the elected officials includes directly impacted people. They can be people who are formerly incarcerated, or who are on parole, or family members who have or did have a loved one who was incarcerated. In addition, well-meaning and concerned citizens also join that group, so that there's a collective voice of people. We also take our interns. We had a 15-year-old high school student who joined us, and he stepped right up and he said, Mr. Senator, my role at the office is I prepared that packet that's in your hand. And the senator said, oh, well, let me read it. But the point is that we've been going around and meeting with people and talking to them about why this issue matters to us. We've also explained to them something that most of the elected officials, in fact, we haven't come across one so far who knew this, and I'm going to share it, and I would bet that many of you didn't know it as well. In addition to the fact that, but for the executive order in this state, parolees could not vote, and that people who are incarcerated in this state cannot vote. Research has been done by Professor Hedwig Lee that's found that family members who have an incarcerated loved one are very unlikely to engage in any civic practice. That includes voting, community boards, school districts, block associations, co-op boards, whatever the self-governance manifestation is. Family members who have incarcerated loved ones have kind of disappeared from the participatory process, which means not only the 46,000 plus the 38,000, but all of those family members have not been engaged in the process. So our campaign also includes reaching out to the people in the community to help them to understand why it's so important for them to use their civic right to vote. Their civic right impacts who are the judges. That judge who's giving away sentences that look like Social Security numbers, well, the people in the community have the ability to vote them out. Okay? That district attorney who grossly overcharges and tries to bury people underneath the prison for life, they can be voted out. Many people don't realize that, and don't realize the collective power that they have to do something about the systems and the oppression that are impacting their lives. So, as you see, our campaign is three-pronged. So when we talk to our elected officials, we explain that to them. Now, if we just went in and said, excuse me, I'm going to violate the code for a second. Good afternoon, Mr. Aubrey. We want all inmates to be able to vote. We'd be ushered out, right? Now, we don't also use that word, but we start off with talking about the right to citizenship and what that means. And that in order for a democracy to run efficiently and optimally, it means full participation by the citizens in the community. Now, all elected officials depend on what? Votes. Right? So you start with the thing that matters to them, and you make it clear, whoever's in our group who lives in that borough, you may say, hi, I live in Brooklyn. I'm one of your constituents. Then you have their undivided attention, right? Because they figure if you took the time to come there, and you made it clear to them that you live in Brooklyn and they're from Brooklyn, you might encourage people not to vote for them if they're not supporting this issue. And so we talk about the civic engagement of family members, and then we move to the issue of parolees and people behind bars. That we talk about, we want people to return to the community and be active, contributing members of society. One of the ways that we accomplish that is for people to feel that they are part of the society and they're participating in the democratic process. Now, I just modeled for you what your speech will be. And by the time you finish, everybody's head is nodding, kind of in the amen way, and that's what you want. And then you give them this, and that's why you have it. That helps them to read through, and then they see what the goals are and why. It's not that challenging. You just have to kind of know how to approach it. And some of them will say, but is it a law that people can't vote if they're incarcerated? And the answer is what?
Yes.
It is a law. But does it have to be?
Yeah.
No. There's nothing in the Constitution that says people have to lose the right to vote because they've been convicted of a felony. Because if that was part of the Constitution, Maine and Vermont couldn't do what they do, right? You'd also be interested to know that in Puerto Rico, people who are incarcerated can vote. They can. It's also true that in Maine, you may not be a registered voter before you went to prison, but you can register to vote while you are in prison and then start voting. So it's extremely important that we move this envelope. We have to move this envelope because there are a number of criminal justice reforms that have happened in New York State. And I think we're making progress, but we're moving on the low-hanging fruit. We're not moving on the high-hanging fruit. And Penny, I know you know this well. If we look at what happened with Raise the Age in New York State, it was Raise the Age light, just like Bud Light.
Right.
Okay? But a significant number of young people between the ages of 16 and 18, particularly if they were charged with a violent offense, nothing changed for them in this system. But you have people in Albany and across the state saying, oh yeah, we passed Raise the Age. And that is not actually true. So we're not going to allow this issue about voting to be felony disenfranchisement light. No, we're going for hard sight, okay? So we're going to try to move the entire process so that everybody in this state who is a citizen, regardless of their criminal history, can vote. That's their constitutional right, and statutorily, it should not be taken away. That's our posture. Now, there may be some people in the room who disagree. I'll talk to you behind the building later. No. Right, the woodshed. Thank you. But no, in all seriousness, I didn't think about the woodshed.
We're in the country now.
I have other options. So, I mean, in all truthfulness, we could disagree about whether or not this is the way to go. Obviously, I feel very passionate about it, and this is, we have a whole campaign around this. We're partnering with other organizations around the state. We are partnering with an entity called CUP, the Center for Urban Pedagogy, that has engaged with some graphic designers, and in partnership, those young graphic designers are creating a poster that explains to people the various reasons that voting is important and how they should engage with the process. They're making 1,000 of these posters for us for free, and we're going to distribute them all over the state of New York. We're hoping that there'll be people in this room who will be willing to take those posters and put them up, who'll go meet with your local elected officials, and who'll come join us in Albany, because next legislative session, we're going to do a number of advocacy days where we're going to go and meet with elected officials in their Albany offices. Because as we know, this is a large, spread out, mountainous state, and it may not be so easy for us to travel to everybody's district office. Obviously, our partners who are in those districts can do that, but in Albany, we know we can cover everybody else who we didn't get to see in person in their district offices. And our hope is, and we all know, nothing beats the failure but a try, and we're going to try as hard as possible to move that needle. so that we can look to our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren and say, we did something significant to really make democracy a reality for all citizens in this state, and no longer will a mistake that someone did that resulted in them having a felony conviction smear their opportunity to exercise their citizen rights. So I think I covered what everybody can do. If I didn't, oh, how could I leave out this one thing? We're going to do a walk. We're not, some of you are familiar with the fact that, and Penny has on the t-shirt, that 2 years ago, somebody in this room who will remain nameless had the mad idea to march from Harlem to Albany to the fact that there were human rights abuses taking place in the prisons and jails throughout the state. It was a 19-day march. We survived it. It was wonderful in that we built relationships with thousands of new people and hundreds of new organizations, and raised attention and awareness about this issue. We're not going to march from Harlem to Albany ever again. But we are going to do 5K walks. I talked with Penny about this a few months ago, and at that time it was a 10K, and she said, maybe you could take it down to a 5K and get more participants. I said, that's actually a wise idea, Penny. 5K sounds good. So we're going to have them done simultaneously all around the state. We're going to ask our friends and allies to stage them in their local communities, and we'll do them all at the same time. And at the end, it'll culminate in a little rally and a mock voting process. We will have a voting box, and we'll give out a ballot, and people will check whether or not they agree that people should be able to vote if they're incarcerated, if they're not, or if they're on parole. Either a yes or no. Very simple ballot, right? You don't need to computerize it. It'll be easy to count and tally, and then we'll have a little press conference where you announce the outcome of the vote. But it's a way another way to draw more attention to the issue. We were going to do it this October. Emily, who's our development director and all things operations, talked me out of that idea. So we're going to do it in the spring, during the period of time that the legislature is in session, so that we have all these moving parts happening at the same time. So we're hoping that some of you will be interested in participating and organizing these 5K walks. We're calling them Vote to Vote, right? Vote, the number 2, vote. And that's it in a nutshell. So I'm open to questions. Woodshed participants.
Thank you, Sophia. Is there a question or two? Let's take 1 or 2 questions, and then some time to open up the circle and pull in some new chairs for others who arrive. Go ahead, Jane.
So I'm under the impression, which could be wrong totally, that people who are incarcerated in the North Country are counted as residents of the North Country, but they're not allowed to vote. So even though they're mostly urban people of color, their non-voting selves counts in the representation of the conservative representatives from upstate New York. Is that true?
It used to be. That used to be the way it was, but that changed 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay.
So now the person's home is the census area where they're counted. So their home is not considered to be where they're incarcerated. Their home is where they lived at the time that they got convicted.
Okay.
The other thing that I realized, I'm glad you raised that question because it reminded me of something. We are advocating that people's votes count in their home district, not where, so let's just say however many prisons there are up here in the Adirondacks, we're not saying that those people's will be, the people who are incarcerated in those facilities are voting for your local elected people in the Adirondacks. No, that their votes should count in the district where they are from.
Because that was a major barrier, I feel like. The representatives up here didn't want those votes, because it would swing upstate, it could possibly swing upstate New York.
We don't want those
Democratic.
votes counted up here either. That's probably the one thing we agree on.
Okay.
So no, and we've been very clear when we talk to elected officials where we want the votes to be. We talked to one guy, Assemblyman Abate, and comes from a fairly conservative area in Brooklyn. And I was going to meet with him with a couple of other of our members, and we were sitting out in the car, because we were early, kind of musing about what this meeting with him was going to be about. We were all prepared for all kinds of pushback. And this was a really good lesson for us. We laid out our pitch the way I laid it out to you. He did not hesitate. He went right to, would he be able to go into the facilities and campaign? How could he get his literature inside the prisons? Would he be allowed to go to the forum? Would there be a political debate in that he'd be debating against, his challenger? We were amazed, because it never occurred to us to include that in the conversation, okay? So you just don't know how the conversation might unfold. So we don't make any more assumptions about where people are gonna come from on this issue. We just make sure that we have our compelling message. Yes?
Well, I thought in Vermont and Maine, they actually count the votes in where they're incarcerated.
I don't know where they count them in
And I
there.
kind of wonder if there's been a study of that, because I remember there was some pushback, in case this issue comes up, but there was some pushback over especially school board elections and things like that,
Well,
so.
here, we're saying that the people who are incarcerated, their vote should count in their
Right.
home district. So
It's really important.
we'll be even more of a leader. Picture that. Other questions? Yes?
First, a quick follow-up to that. So I worked for the census 10 years ago up here and did enumerate the Hamilton County Jail. That's what census workers are described as, enumerators. So you're saying a change happened between the last census and this one?
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned jails. People who have not been convicted but are in a jail awaiting disposition of their case legally can vote. The problem is what processes have been put into place so that they can actually vote. So part of what was compelling the state legislature to make some of the changes that they did this year to make it easier for people who are in jail to be able to vote as absentee ballot.
Well, my real question was to avoid a woodshed encounter. I'm sure we agree, but obviously there are plenty of people who don't agree with your wise position on enfranchisement, full enfranchisement, including prisoners. I'd like to hear the